Well, good evening. This is Captain Aaron Bresnahan, retired, the Continental Commandery Commander. We're now happy to have you with us for our second webinar, where we have a great opportunity to be able to promote the Naval Order of the United States and also have an opportunity to interact with people that are making a huge impact for our sea services. So as many of you may or may not know a little bit about the Naval Order history, we have been established since July 4th, 1890. We're an organization that is here to preserve, promote, and celebrate and enjoy the nation's sea services, especially its history and heritage. We also want to commemorate American Sea Service heroes and important historical events. We support the study of naval history through writing, through speaking, and through educational events. So this is a perfect example of where we're living up to that mission. But we also want to preserve the sea service historical artifacts, and we want to promote camaraderie amongst our companions and members of similar organizations. What makes the Naval Order unique is that we're the oldest American hereditary, exclusively naval society. We're dedicated to the interest of naval history and encourage its recording and preservation. And the provision for membership is based upon lineal descent, ensuring strong continuous interest in the deeds and accomplishments of our forebears in perpetuity. And our linkage is to our predecessors that forges a common bond and is responsible for the honorable service of our country. So as I mentioned today, we have a great time ahead of us to have some questions and answers with our two wonderful guests that we have with us. So today we have Vince Patton, who was the 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard. And we also have Jason Vanderhaden, who's the current Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and being the 13th. So we're really happy to have both of you with us, and we're really looking forward to what you can share with us about the Coast Guard, the history of the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard role and office, and to hear a little bit more about what's new and exciting within the Coast Guard. So great to have you with us.
Thank you, Captain.
All right. Well, without further ado, then maybe we could jump into a few questions and just get a feel for a few items regarding the history of the Master Chief Petty Officer. But also I want you, the audience, to know that we do have the opportunity to take additional questions. So for those that are on the call, you can see that there's on the side a chat room function. So as you come up with questions or things of interest, just go ahead and type the question in there, and then we'll try to address those as time goes on. So one of the first things that I would love to hear a little bit about is, how was the establishment of the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer on the 18th of May, 1920? How was that pivotal to the Coast Guard history? So maybe if you could let us know about that, that would be wonderful.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll start off with that being the old guy, probably closer in age to when the creation of chiefs in the Coast Guard occurred compared to Jason. For the Coast Guard, folks often wondered, well, why didn't the Coast Guard have chief petty officers as well as the enlisted rank structure set up the same way how the Navy was done? And the answer to that was that for those who know a little of the Coast Guard's history as a whole, is that prior to 1915, the Coast Guard was split up into the Revenue Cutter Service, U.S. Life Saving Service, and there was a totally different rank structure, if you want to call it that. The Revenue Cutter Service, which tended to be the bulk of what the traditions of the Coast Guard came about when it was merged in 1915. It came about at that time. There was some discussion about besides the officer ranks, which the officer ranks for the most part were the same as the Navy officers ranks. There were some variable differences, but the officer ranks were pretty much the same. But on the enlisted side, they weren't really enlisted. They were actually just contracted civilians, so to speak, under the Revenue Cutter Service and under the U.S. Life Saving Service. They were government employees The chief person was called the keeper of the station and so forth. So there was a discussion right around that 1915 mark when the merging of the Coast Guard came about, but it kind of went slow, and it wasn't until just after World War I that the discussion then kicked up in the higher gear that the rank structures, particularly on the enlisted side, needed to be common, not just because of the Navy, as was the case that during World War I, the Coast Guard fought with the Navy, but more so to have that structure with responsibilities so it's more laid and ironed out. So it wasn't until that came into being in 1920 that the Chief Petty Officer rank of the U.S. Coast Guard came into being. Prior to 1920, there were petty officers and so forth, but there was no Chief Petty Officer rank, and the reason for that was the fact that the Coast Guard was still trying to figure itself out under its new layout as being called the U.S. Coast Guard. And the positions of Chief Petty Officer was kind of variable because there was a question of, do we make a lot of warrants or do we make more officers or whatever the case may be. But it wasn't until 1920 that the decision was made that Chief Petty Officers were going to come to be. So it was a 5-year mission to get to that point.
It sounds like an incredible journey, and as you say, with all of the sort of different agencies and organizations coming together, it sounds like it was quite a pivotal time in the Coast Guard. So, Jason, do you have something to add as well?
Vince is a student of history and knows that very well. You explained it extremely well. One thing about the Coast Guard is we have so many small units around that we don't have enough officers to put an officer at every unit. A lot of times in the Navy, even the smallest units will have officers there, but in the Coast Guard, that's not the case. So having the Chief Petty Officer kind of be the officer in charge at the unit, we provide our enlisted members non-judicial punishment authority, which is, we're the only service that does that. So the chiefs kind of freed up the officers to not have to be the one-off at every small little unit around the Coast Guard, which gave the chiefs that added responsibility and enabled us to save some money, if you will. Also, chiefs are a little more economical in terms of salary. So that's something unique to the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officers.
It definitely sounds like it's made, as you say, the biggest impact for the buck. So it's a huge savings for the country, but also I'm sure it makes the mission more successful and more able to be executed. So that's great. I guess one other question then I would like to ask is, how has the function of the chief's mess evolved over time? So it sounded like in 1915 to 1920 there was quite a bit of planning and trying to understand the role. But so how has that function evolved over the last 100 years?
Well, I'll start off first with it, and Jason can bring up a little more into the now category. But the term chief's mess as a whole really didn't take shape into the Coast Guard until around World War II. And I think that's right about the time when there were a lot more functionary chiefs at a unit, particularly on board ships, than they had been before. Because as Jason had mentioned, when Chief Petty Officers were created in 1920, and from the 1920s into the early 40s, before World War II came about, most units only had one chief. There may have been two at certain types of places, but not a very large number. So there was no real chief's mess as you compared it to the Navy. World War II changed that, because at that time, as the Coast Guard started beefing up in numbers and the types of assignments that were given to them, the more ships were created. And at the stations, which also had a wartime mission, particularly on the coast and so forth, you started having several chiefs at a particular unit. And that's where it began to grow into this fraternity, if it will, of where people of that like type of specialty, a rating, as the case may be, decided that this is where we need to function more collectively as a group rather than individually. And I think they just kind of follow a little bit of the pattern of how the Navy Chiefs Mess was going, as well as looking at how the wardroom culture was being set up. Not 100% the same, but certainly some parallels that came about to that. So it wasn't until just around World War II that even in the Coast Guard's terminology, Chiefs Mess actually came into being.
So as of today, the Chiefs Mess, they do a lot of the taking care of the workforce, taking care of the enlisted workforce. So the Chiefs, I stole this from the Navy, but it pertains. The Chiefs kind of run the ship so the officers can fight the ship. The Chiefs make sure that the crew is trained, they're ready to perform the mission. So when we hit the go button and we set the law enforcement bill, or we set the GE or GQ or whatever it is that we're doing, that the crew is ready to go and they are focused on the mission. The Chiefs are engaging the workforce to talk to them about their family, make sure that they're full up, round, and ready to perform the mission. And when you make chief, you lose your first name, and then you become everybody's chief. So the mess is very helpful because you might be walking across the flight deck and somebody says, "Hey, chief," you turn around and you take, and they have an issue or a problem. You handle that, you help them with it, and then you go back to the mess, and you might see their chief, that division chief, and say, "Hey, I just talked to Petty Officer so and so and helped them with a problem they were having." And it doesn't matter that you're not their chief, because we're all our responsibility is to take care of the workforce. And then we also we mentor the junior officers. So when you have an ensign or a lieutenant JG, maybe sometimes a lieutenant that might be doing something new for the first time, the chiefs kind of take them under their wing, make sure that they understand what what's going on, what the challenges are, and kind of help them quickly get up to speed, so that they can be that division officer or that department head that the department needs. And so that's why when you're all together in a mess, the mess functions as the sum is greater than the parts. It's we're all working together to achieve a common goal, which is to make sure that we have a ready workforce.
Just a bit of a follow-up question on that. Does the Chiefs Mess act differently based on the mission set that the Coast Guard has? Because I know with like oil pollution prevention or life-saving or boarding or interdictions, is there a difference across the mission sets, or?
No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty common across all the mission sets, at least the units that I've been to. I mean, clearly there are some units which are much more singular, like, for example, the tactical law enforcement teams and so forth, that, because that's all they do. So it's that way. But aboard ship at large bases and stations where there are several chiefs, everybody kind of works together. Everybody has to work together because it's a small unit as a whole. And as Jason pointed out, that since there are few officers across the board overall, and you've got the chiefs that kind of run things, run the enlisted workforce as a group. In a Chiefs Mess, in order to be a very effective Chiefs Mess, you got to know what everybody else does. And I think back to my only afloat tour as a chief was when I was with Chief Yeoman on the Boutwell. In addition to just doing my role as working as a yeoman, I also had to function with what that unit's responsibility was, and that being maritime law enforcement, support to naval activities and so forth. So I had to know just as much, or at least learn about things, what was going on down in the engine room, what was going on in the weapons department, and so forth. And that's where our chief's mess was really helpful, because it gave me the opportunity to really reach out and touch with other ratings in the Coast Guard, to be able to understand and learn to do those particular things. So I would say, as a chief, you really are a chief, and then whatever your specialty is beyond that is secondary to the functions as a chief and taking care of everybody. So you weren't in a parochial fashion that all you handle was just people within your specific rating, because our units are not that big to be able to do that. You had to know pretty much what, now again, the departments and what I mentioned and so forth, and you will be working very closely with each of those departments.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. The function and roles of the chief's mess are pretty universal. No matter what unit you go to, the way the mess functions at each unit is basically the same, which is to, like what Vince said, just to take care of the people.
Okay, great. And as we always hear, the reason why the U.S. Military is so effective is because of the senior non-commissioned officers and all of the gravitas that you bring, and obviously the emphasis and leadership that you have to get things done. I guess next question I'd like to talk a little bit about is, has the integration of the Coast Guard, active, reserve, auxiliary, civilians, the contractors and families, has that changed the roles of the chief, when you look at all the different aspects of the stakeholders within the Coast Guard?
Well, I'm going to start off first, but I'm sure Jason's answer is probably going to be not just more updated, but I think a little bit more progressive than from the time that I would view that when I was on active duty. Is the key part of what we had always expected of chiefs, and I'll date this even further back to when I first became a chief in 1983, that you really had to embrace all levels of the Coast Guard family, and not just from the active reserve side, but we have auxiliaries, we have family members, and so forth. So, and it was very, very important, because there were certain units, certain responsibilities that we were involved with, that we involved with working with auxiliaries, we involved with working with civilians, with the civilian Coast Guard community as well. So it was, at least the time when I became a chief, it was really impressed upon me that I had to understand and accept the entire Coast Guard community concept. So I don't think at the time when I became a chief that was the first time they started doing it, but I will say that it was at that time that there were some struggles, because many chiefs felt they didn't have to do that wasn't their responsibility beyond within their realm of their department or their people that they had to work with. But then later it all became sort of a big happy family kind of thing, that everybody had to work together. Jason?
So thank you, Vince. I'm going to go right on to that, because Vince is exactly right. As our missions have grown post 9/11, and we have really had to rely on the auxiliary to do some things that maybe we didn't always have to do. We did organically in the active duty workforce, and then we integrated. Our reserve component is no longer a separate component. It's no longer a separate kind of arm of the Coast Guard. Our reserve units are integrated into our active duty units. So we are, as Vince said, one big happy family, all working together to achieve the mission. And as a chief's mess, if the mission's not a success, then we're not a success. So having to really understand how all the various components of the workforce work together to accomplish the mission. That's the chiefs have to understand that, and then maximize everybody's talent to get the job done. So I echo what Vince said.
Great answer. Thanks for that. I also want to remind everybody on the webinar that if you do think of any questions, please feel free to just type those into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. we'd love to hear from you and have a chance to get those burning questions answered as well. All right. So earlier, when you were talking about the formation of the chiefs 100 years ago, you mentioned there was sort of a debate between whether you wanted more warrant officers or have chiefs. So I guess one follow-up question to that would be, have the career aspirations to pursue to become a Master Chief Petty Officer versus a warrant officer, has that changed over time? How do you perceive that?
Well, my answer is a little dated, and then of course Jason will give the real answer here. But for me, particularly during my tenure in my time in the Coast Guard and so forth, that the chief warrant officers category was sort of a category to where individuals who were looking to progress as far as promotion to that level were looking at where their career aspirations was, what the job entailed, and each specialty is different, with some differences, particularly like bosun, for example, because there are Master Chief Bosun mates, Senior Chief Bosun mates, Chief Bosun mates doing pretty much primarily the same type of job that a Chief Warrant Bosun would do. But in other particular ratings, there are big differences, particularly assignments in the marine safety world, which is now called response prevention type roles and so forth. So, but I think it became more of an individual thought at the time. I have always been of the opinion, I've always supported any individual who wanted to progress through the Coast Guard if they looked at wanting to become a chief versus wanting to become a warrant. I always ask them that magic question: is your reason for going warrant because it's more money, or do you really understand what kinds of things that you would do as a warrant versus what kinds of things that you would do as you move up the scale beyond Chief Petty Officer? And that was a challenging question to many people that, they really started thinking about it. And some decided at that point that, they were going to stay in the enlisted ranks versus going to warrant. And others felt to go through the warrant ranks because some of the avenues to that is an opportunity to go from warrant officer to commissioned officer. And particularly, we have the warrant to lieutenant program, which a lot of warrants are interested in wanting to go to that. But I always challenge folks of wanting to look at further down the road of their career beyond making more money, because in the long run, a Master Chief and a Chief Warrant Officer, the monetary differences are very almost near equal, as opposed to looking at someone going from Chief to Warrant and so forth. So that's kind of like within my realm of life in the Coast Guard. Jason?
So I totally agree. As Vince said, I encourage everyone, all folks that are advancing up to the enlisted ranks, to explore both career fields, both Chief Warrant Officer and Senior Chief Master Chief. The warrant officers are a specialty, as Vince said. The Coast Guard pays you to specialize. They pay you to become a subject matter expert in a particular area, and then you advise and do what leverage your knowledge and your expertise and your subject matter expertise in that area. And then as a chief, as I mentioned earlier, you're everybody's chief. You're more of a generalist. You're still very sharp and an expert in your field, but you're more of a take care of a people side of the workforce. So I tell people, I said, if your goal is to really get to be the expert, a subject matter expert in a specialty, perhaps warrant officer is for you. If you like taking care of people, growing people, and developing people, perhaps Senior Chief or Master Chief might be more in your world, what you enjoy doing. Because at the end of the day, as Vince said, it's not about the money. It doesn't matter how much I pay you. If you don't like coming to work, if you don't like what you do, the pay will soon be not worth it. I could pay you a lot more, and you wouldn't do it. So you have to like what you do. You have to choose the path that is going to make you the happiest coming to work, because that in the end will make you better at what you do if you enjoy it. So I some of my best friends are chief warrant officers. I value them a lot, and they have a definite role in the organization. And they still, once a chief, always a chief. Many of them are strong members of the chief. Many chief warrant officers are strong members of the chief's mess. And I think we work together well. And it's just a matter of what you like to do coming to work. And I don't mean to be a generalist. Many chief warrant officers are excellent at taking care of people and leading people, and are very involved in what's going on in their people's lives. But that's not really what the Coast Guard pays them to do. The Coast Guard pays them to be the expert in a particular area of the Coast Guard.
And let me add one more thing, particularly with how the aspirations have changed over time. Since I retired in 2002 and up to Jason's tenure at this point, the aspirations, I believe, have changed greatly in terms of people wanting to be Master Chiefs. And why? Because during my tenure, I actually struggled with this question about looking at the career paths and so forth. And I wrote a study, the Senior Enlisted Needs Assessment. And part of that study was the fact of really defining/redefining what we want our senior chiefs and master chiefs in the Coast Guard to do and be. And what I was getting at was looking at the fact that there was a need to create more senior enlisted roles in the command master chief type level. In other words, to grow those folks up to that point. Because up to the time when I became master chief of the Coast Guard, those who were in this command chief's path, which was very collateral and often depends on what unit that you were in, it just wasn't open to a lot of people. Since that time, my successors beyond that have grown the position a lot more, and we have a very, very nice structured path of looking at people going up to Master Chief, and I think Jason can talk a little bit more about now at his level what he's doing, particularly with the selection for Master Chief.
Oh, thank you, Vince. So we had a lot of chief warrant officers. There's 1,700 chief warrant officers in the Coast Guard. And we have far fewer master chiefs, and it was an attractive career path to go chief warrant officer, because you had a 92% opportunity of selection for W3 and a 90% opportunity of selection for W4, and you didn't have to take a test if you were a good performer doing your job and got good evaluations, then you were almost a guarantee to get promoted. And in the enlisted side, you had to take a test, you had to get performance qualifications, you had to get recommendation, and it was if you didn't happen to study what questions that were on that test, you could be the greatest leader of all time and not make Master Chief. So we have changed the process some now, and the Commandant has agreed to allow us to have a selection panel. So August 11th, we will convene our first Master Chief advancement panel, and we will choose our Master Chiefs no longer from a test, but from performance, and it'll be merit-based.
Great answer. A lot of detail there, and hopefully a lot of people were taking notes on this career and what to do. But you mentioned leadership quite a few times in some of your answers, and it's often been said lately that this is the first time that we've ever had 5 different generations in the workforce at the same time. Do you find that you've had to adjust your traditional approach to leadership when dealing with millennials or now the Gen Z, or just dealing differently with generations?
Well, for me, I don't know what that generation labeling was when I came in 1972, but often think about the old timers, the old chiefs and senior chiefs and master chiefs and so forth that looked upon my era of people as a group of challenging people that was far different than what they were. And by the time I retired in 2002, and particularly when we started labeling these generations, for me, it was the Generation X time frame coming in about the time before I retired, was I saw not a challenge. What I saw was an opportunity, a better opportunity of how we work with people, because you might want to call us being more sophisticated in the way of how we manage and lead people. But I'd like to think of it more scholastic, that as time has gone on, and I think this was probably the same time when I came in, that what the old timers griped about people like my era was we asked too many questions. We came in with this process of wanting to know an awful lot and all these other kind of things, instead of just do what we tell you to do and that's it. And as I see these times have gone on, I now see a wonderful challenge, and that's why I call it scholastic, because first of all, I make the comparison that folks coming into the Coast Guard today, more than half of them have some college, if not a college degree. When I came in 1972, now it was a little different because it was the tail end of the Vietnam War, so you did have a lot of people with a lot of college. But then soon after that, and then when I became a recruiter in mid-70s, in 1976, just about everybody came in with just a high school diploma, and that was it. So the educational level was very different, but then it began to creep up again and again and again. And now, as I look back, and I've had the opportunity since retirement to go visit our training center in Cape May as recently as last summer. I'm talking to people and companies and so forth, and you hardly see a hand not go up when you say, how many of you out here have college education? Just about everybody has it. So sophisticated, maybe. I like to say they're a lot more scholastic, and I think that's very positively challenged with knowing that we're getting the best and brightest that's coming in today.
I agree. Scholastic is a great way to put it, Vince. The leadership, the Chiefs message, it's interesting because the Chiefs, you try to standardize. You have high standards, and then you try to help people achieve those high standards, and you help people achieve their potential. When I came in, I was told, you will do what the chief tells you to do, how the chief tells you to do it. Don't ask questions, and salute smartly and carry on. And I was okay with that. That was perfectly fine with me. I didn't ask questions. I made sure I understood what was required of me, and then I did it. And then as I noticed that that was, as I grew as a leader, that was not. The people ask the young folks started asking questions, and I'm like, oh, I'm not used to this. They're asking questions. But then I started to appreciate the questions they were asking me, because they were informed questions. They were educated, as Vince said, that they started coming in better educated. And so I had to acknowledge that education, acknowledge their intellect, and then use my experience. So then you start to allow them and actually encourage them to ask questions. You have to be humble enough to know that sometimes there's a better way to do something, and a junior member might show you that better way to do it. And just the ability to accept their feedback, accept their suggestions is a little bit different, and we've had to evolve. So I think now leading is more of a collaborative process with your subordinates than it was a directive process in the past. I also think that the generation now, as a leader, you almost need to. Some people need a push. So if somebody is not, you think they have higher potential than they are living up to, maybe they're a little bit lazy, or they're not doing everything that they could to maximize their potential. You may need to push them. You see that they're not doing enough. And then some people come in and they are doing everything they can. They're working as hard as they can, and they just can't they need a pull. So that you don't have to kick them in the butt. You have to reach your hand out and pull them. And so understanding that nuance so that you can get the best out of your people is super important. The post 9/11 GI Bill changed our retention model. The blended retirement system is also going to change our retention model. leadership, especially leadership in the chief's mess, is going to be critical to retaining a talented workforce, because this new workforce is going to have options that I didn't have, and I know Vince didn't have. And so I'm thankful that our leaders have evolved and the chief's mess has evolved, and to get the most out of their people and become a more collaborative leadership style.
Great answers. And I think you also mentioned earlier when you were talking about people wanting to come to work and feeling like they're there to live up to a higher purpose or to be able to contribute to something bigger than themselves. And I see these generations coming in now, that's, what their purpose is and how they can contribute is a big part of what motivates them. So I'm sure the way you deal with that from a leadership perspective is critical. I guess to transition to another question, how can the lessons of the chiefs, or what can they derive, the chiefs today derive from the traditions of the chief initiation or the chief's call to indoctrination to improve or to develop chiefs of the future? This is
squarely in Vince's wheelhouse right here.
Well, okay, forgive me if this is going to be too long of an answer, and because that's a very important question, and I've got a lot of corporate knowledge to that, because the current CCTI, the Chief's Call to Initiation, I think is what we're calling it now today, was arrived in the mid '90s as a result of, at the time, I was Atlantic Area Command Master Chief at the time, and we were doing our Chiefs initiations pretty much the same way how the Navy was doing them, and it was more of a just straight line rites of passage, fraternal type initiation process. And my boss at the time was, who was the Atlantic Area Commander at the time, Admiral Paul Welling, came into my office and with a draft all Atlantic area message that he wanted to do away with chiefs initiations. Now the question was, why does he? I said, whoa, Admiral, what's going on here? And he says, well, can you give me an answer why we do initiations? I mean, a legitimate answer why we're doing it, not just because you made chief and I got it, but what's the value of it to the Coast Guard? What's the value of it to the taxpayers? He asked a very good question. So next stop I did was pick up the phone and call the Master Chief of the Coast Guard, who was Master Chief number 6 at the time, and Master Chief Jay Lloyd, and he summoned myself and the Pacific Area Master Chief, Rick Trent, who later became Master Chief number 7. It's interesting that the guys that pinned us together was Master Chief number 6, 7, and 8, as it turned out that way, to sit down and work on redoing and relooking and examining, why are we doing this? And is there true value in it? Admiral Welling had, he really had the right thought in mind, was let's take a step back and figure out what this is all about. And we did. And what we came up with was looking at not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but most importantly was taking the value of the fact when someone becomes chief, and Jason used this term about your first name changes to chief when you put on the anchors and so forth, is that there's a lot more that goes into this. So how do we best define with tradition and with value the level of responsibility that a new chief petty officer takes? And taking that step back is looking at, well, what do we want out of our chiefs? And one of the key things, and I use this phrase an awful lot, that the chiefs are first and foremost the senior mentors of the Coast Guard. I mean, when you say chief petty officer, the word phrase that goes behind chief is mentor. And that, of course, involves with the training aspect as well as the working with people and so forth. So we sort of embraced ourselves around that phrase about mentoring, and therefore to be an effective mentor is how much do you know about the organization? And what our initiation process prior to that never really got into that. I mean, we did some fun little silly things and so forth, but nothing that really had value. Going back to Admiral Welling's point is that where's the value of this both to the Coast Guard and to the taxpayers? And so as a result of that, the final line out of this was building an understanding of the organization itself. To be the senior mentor of the Coast Guard, know about the Coast Guard, know everything about the Coast Guard. You know, it's sad to say, from the time I graduated from boot camp up till about when I went to the Chief Petty Officers Academy in 1990, I did not know the words to Semper Paratus beyond the first two lines. I did not know how to sing the whole song. I knew the tune of it, and that was about it. And I soon learned that there were a lot of people, enlisted people like myself, that didn't know it either. The officers, on the other hand, particularly those that go to the academy, that went to officer candidate school, they had to learn this right off the top. So we put that in there, but more than just learning the words, but learning the meaning and the understanding of it, part of learning about the organization. So we did that. We built that into what the CCTI process was all about, and change. I mean, it was a cultural change that literally was done overnight. And it took, the old timers who just, you're turning this into the kindler Coast Guard kind of thing and not really understanding it, to the new coming people. It's, I get it. This is what I want. This now makes me want to be a chief. And the other things that we've thrown in that program, particularly with the craftsmanship of building your hat box that uses the tradition of the changing of the hat, and everything else in between about learning more about the organization. So, people like Master Chief Vanderhaden, who has not had the knowledge or involvement with the initiation that I went through, is to the point now, they didn't even know the old system, and I'm glad they don't. It is so far gone at this point that all they know is how it is. I shared my Chief's Charge book with Master Chief Vanderhaden, and which I'm glad I did, because in the comparison to what a charge book looked today, which is filled with factual information about the history of the Coast Guard, and again, taking that chief into being the senior mentor of the organization, to also be the lamplighter of Coast Guard history. And that was the other part of what we did with the initiation process, to give it that meaning. So therefore, to answer Admiral Welling's question, what's the value in it? And what's the value to the Coast Guard? What's the value to the American taxpayer?
So I can't do better than that. I wouldn't even try. That's just, I love to hear Vince tell that story. So just real quick, Captain, CCTI, Chiefs Call to Initiation. I hope that the Chiefs develop the acronym CCTI: Communication, Cooperation, Trust, and Inclusion. The Chiefs need to communicate amongst each other in the mess and communicate with the wardroom up and down the chain of command. They have to cooperate. The Chiefs network is absolutely critical for the success of the Coast Guard and to take care of our people. We have to. There's a lot of trust in amongst chiefs. They have to trust each other. And then inclusion, as Vince said, I am thankful that I did not have to participate in the CCTI that Vince did, and that and the Chiefs Mess wasn't always the most inclusive place. In fact, it was very exclusive, and you had to have thick skin, and you had to be able to hold your own in there. I think we're trying to change that a little bit to where the Chiefs Mess is very inclusive. Everybody feels valued, and everybody's equal within the Chiefs Mess. So CCTI. Communication, cooperation, trust, and inclusion.
All right, great. Did you have another comment, or?
Oh no, I like that. I like CCTI is redefined in definition. That's great. I love it when a plan comes together. 25 years it took to get to this point. So I get goosebumps every time I hear something new that happens with the CCTI process.
And Vince Vince has been mentoring me a long time, and the reason we are at the CCTI we have right now is almost solely thanks to Vince and his leaning forward and making sure that it continued on.
Thank you.
That's a great story. This is one of these gems that come out in these webinars that we love to hear what happened behind the curtain many years ago. Yeah, so, but if we now talk, so we've been talking about the history of the Chiefs' 100-year celebration this year, but maybe we could talk a little bit more specifically about the MCPOG and the MCPOG role and office. One of the things, so the Chiefs, the Coast Guard Chiefs have been around for 100 years, but the MCPOG office was set up in 1969. So what kind of a difference was it when that happened? It must have been extremely impactful.
Well, I'll start, and I got a lot of corporate knowledge of this by being mentored by the first Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard. When the senior enlisted position started, and I think I'll give you that history too, which really started in 1967 among the DoD services. The Coast Guard deliberately excluded itself from wanting to be a participant of having a senior enlisted leader because of the fact that at the time the culture of the Coast Guard felt they didn't need it. And in fact, by absentia, if you really needed a Master Chief of the Coast Guard, you go to the Master Chief of the Navy. So the real first Master Chief of the Coast Guard was Master Chief Dale Black, U.S. Navy, who was the first Master Chief of the Navy. And it was Dale Black that actually advocated to push to have the Master Chief of the Coast Guard position. Just so happens he was on a flight with the Commandant of the Coast Guard coming back from Vietnam. They were in Vietnam visiting units. And Dale visited the Coast Guard units while he was visiting the Navy units and so forth. On the flight back, he kind of gave the Commandant a mouthful of how the Coast Guard is missing out on having a senior enlisted leader. And he convinced the Commandant to have a Master Chief of the Coast Guard position. And then as a result of that, the first Master Chief of the Coast Guard was created in August of 1969. And it was not met with a lot of fanfare. In fact, there were more Master Chiefs and Senior Chiefs and Chiefs in the Coast Guard that were against having the position than there were even officers. And that was a real tough job for the first Master Chief of the Coast Guard, because not only was he put into this new role and responsibility with a boss that felt that he had his arm twisted to, okay, let me try you out kind of thing, versus we get you like with enthusiasm like the other services had. But it was kind of a standoff approach in which Master Chief Calhoun, our first Master Chief of the Coast Guard, had a lot of work cut out to himself that followed on with the second and the third Master Chiefs of the Coast Guard that built us to where we are today. And it wasn't until about toward the end of Master Chief Calhoun's tenure, which was in 1973, who championed the Coast Guard uniform that we now wear today to give us identity and working those kinds of things, to really show the importance of the position of the Master Chief of the Coast Guard. And it was more than just a wardrobe aspect of having us look different. It was more importantly giving us our identity and having the identity of the Coast Guard of being what we are. So our multi-mission military roles and responsibilities stand out for what it is, versus we're just the fair-haired stepchildren that sit in the corner that are called upon when needed, whenever that could be. So as I've looked at through the tenures, up through the 13th Master Chief of the Coast Guard, each and every one of us have made significant contributions to the service, that our service itself sees the value and sees the key need of why that position exists. I use this phrase during the time I was Master Chief of the Coast Guard, that I was a Master Chief of the Coast Guard for everybody. I was the Master Chief of the Coast Guard for a captain. I was a Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard for a GS-9, and I was a Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard for a Petty Officer second class. Everybody was, as far as I was concerned, was in my tent. And therefore, because what affects one individual within that structure, regardless of whether you're officer, enlisted, civilian, auxiliarist, or family member, it affected everybody in the Coast Guard as a whole. And I've seen my successors, as well as even my predecessors, have taken on those same types of responsibilities and interest in the fact that you were the Master Chief of the Coast Guard for the entire Coast Guard. And what impacts the Coast Guard as a whole comes from that rank and file group of people who carry out the missions and make things happen as a whole. And as I see today, as I see even during my time, being joined at the hip with the Commandant and the Coast Guard and working through issues and concerns and so forth. During my tenure, I had to deal with 9/11. During Jason's tenure, he had to deal with the government shutdown. He's dealing with the pandemic. But you know what? If the Master Chief ain't sitting at the table, a lot of things aren't going to get done, or at least get done effectively and proactively as they are now.
Yeah, I everything Vince said I echo that, and as a testament to Master Chief Calhoun's leadership and the impact that he had on the service, we have, and also in large part thanks to Master Chief Patton's pressing in, we are going to name the 10th National Security Cutter, our flagship ship of the Coast Guard, after Charles C. Calhoun. So it'll be the 10th National Security Cutter will be the Charles Calhoun, and I want to publicly thank Vince for his leadership in that effort.
Oh, thank you.
It's great to see how the office has evolved in the way that you can sort of make it your own, but also make it for everyone. I'm going to skip. We're having such a good time talking. Time is flying really quickly, so I'll try to highlight a few more quick questions. How does the MCPOCG office influence the way that joint military service is looked at, or how do you impact the joint fight?
Well, I'll start off first. Just from during my tenure, and I can speak a little bit about my predecessors and so forth that really had a very positive, proactive involvement with working with the other service senior enlisted leaders. But for me, one of the key things that I remember, I got to in doing my congressional testimony on the Hill before the Coast Guard committees that I was involved with, but I got to be invited to work with the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, with my counterparts from the other services. One of the key things that we pushed and advocated for was the thrift savings plan. That occurred during our tenure of pushing to get that done, pushing to get the pay raises the way how they were set up. And before, it was a straight across the board, whatever percentage it was, but we pushed to get them targeted. And that wouldn't happen unless the five of us were all together. We were one voice. And I had a blast, particularly when I went to a House Armed Services committee. And I know in the past, my predecessors did not get to do that, but I got to do it during my tenure. That the five of us, the five senior enlisted leaders, we would have these little group meetings before we went out there. And we decided we were going to talk about things that impacted all five of us versus going in to talk about the Army needs new tanks, the Navy needs new ships, et cetera, and so on. We went in there to talk about things that we all needed together. We all advocated for each other. And it was the coolest thing around. I wish I had the video to even show that, to listen to the Sergeant Major of the Army talk about the importance of tactical law enforcement teams for the Coast Guard. And for me to talk about the need for the special forces and impact that is responsible for deployment operations and so forth. So we became a force, I think, to reckon with. And even in retirement now, the four guys that I worked with as senior enlisted leaders at the time, we're still together as a group. And I know that beyond that, my successors, all the way up to Jason, working very close together, and then adding on the senior enlisted advisory chair to the chairman, another big force that helps with looking at the responsibilities for all of our entire military workforce.
Yeah, again, I'm just going to carry on from exactly what Vince said. The senior enlisted advisor, the chairman, the SEAC we call them, that has been a real improvement to all of us getting together. And on just for an example, last Thursday I joined the rest of my colleagues, the senior enlisted advisors for the services. We met with General Milley on Thursday, and then on Friday again we met with Secretary Esper to talk about some of the things that are going on in the military today. Happy to be invited to that. Really neat opportunity. And then we've also now broken into the joint senior enlisted billet structure. So we now have a Coast Guard Master Chief who is the senior enlisted advisor to the combined military forces in Bahrain, working for 5th Fleet. So that's a Coast Guard Master Chief working for a British admiral under 5th Fleet and CENTCOM, which we've never had that before. And then just this summer, our Coast Guard Master Chief was selected to be the senior enlisted advisor to Joint Task Force Guantanamo Bay. And we now submit a Coast Guard Master Chief for each of the joint senior enlisted advisor positions. And we get Bill Hollingsworth was interviewed for AFRICOM. Rob Bushy applied for Southcom, and we are starting to break in. And I think as they get a little more experience with Coast Guard Master Chiefs, when I say they, as DoD gets experience with Coast Guard Master Chiefs, I think they recognize that there's a lot of talent in the Coast Guard as well. So we've been steadily progressing and coming a long way in our support for the Joint Force.
Oh, that's great to hear. And, you quite often you see the Coast Guard being employed, as you said, in CENTCOM because of the law enforcement authorities that you have that you can bring that DoD wouldn't have. And obviously down in Southcom and also in the homeland, in the Northcom AOR, there's a lot of huge impact that your teams are making operationally. But it's also interesting to hear what you're doing from the policy perspective and from influencing how the joint force is shaped and developed. So, but if I could ask one last question, and maybe I'll just direct this one specifically to you, Master Chief Vanderhaden. How could you tell us a little bit what it's like now going through the pandemic that the lockdowns that we've had for the past 3 months, and then obviously with some of the issues related to the protests and, all of what feels a little bit like chaos right now. Can you talk about how your office, how you're dealing with that and how your position is so important for the Coast Guard at a time like this?
Yes, Captain. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been a challenge to all the services. We as a Coast Guard, we have 11 statutory missions, and they're peacetime missions. And so those missions have to be performed. They have to be carried on. The commerce still needs to flow. Search and rescue still needs to happen. We still need to prevent drugs from coming to our shores, and we need to prevent human smuggling through illegal immigration. So we all those things have to continue to happen in this COVID environment. So we have really been trying to stay, on our toes, like literally leaning forward on all our policies, all our techniques, tactics, and procedures, tracking our PPE, making sure that our crews have the training and they understand how to keep themselves safe in this COVID environment. Just for an example, one of our ships was down doing a counter narcotics patrol in the Eastern Pacific and had a bust. We detained some drug smugglers, and it turns out all 5 of them were COVID positive. Yet the crew was savvy enough and skilled enough to be able to keep themselves safe. Not one of our crew members contracted COVID-19, even though they had to manage the detainees. So, we have to constantly be vigilant to how the missions are changing. How for instance, we have as we've kind of minimized our physical presence going on a boarding. So our boarding teams are doing a little bit more of we may be a smaller boarding team. We're a little bit more careful about how we engage with the folks that we do our law enforcement boardings on, and we protect ourselves with PPE. We have, we had to institute a lot of virtual teleworking, if you will, so that we expanded our teleworking capacity exponentially. I mean, orders of magnitude greater than what we had before COVID-19. And, and we've had to PCS people. So we lose about 10% of the Coast Guard a year. So you figure of a force of 42,000, we lose about 4,200 a year. Those people have to be replaced. Their trainings, their skills have to be replaced, and we have to move people into those billets that the people leave the Coast Guard. So we've had to continue our permanent change of station. We've had to continue our schools and our training and our basic training. It's just been it's been a challenge, and we've had a lot of families that have really, sacrificed in order to be able to have their coastie, their service member continue to serve. So I acknowledge the sacrifice of all our families that have perhaps had to have their service member quarantine or self-isolate for a while because they happen to get exposed. And so it's not just the service members that are affected by this, it is the families as well. And this is going to create some kind of readiness gap for us. We were not able to bring in as many people through basic training as we would like. We were not able to get as many people through their tech schools as we would like. And the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Charleston, where we train all our boarding officers and boarding team members and some of our pursuit coxswain folks, the whole facility closed, so we weren't able to push those folks through. So this has been a significant challenge. And then the military has all, in terms of the social unrest and our acknowledgement of perhaps a disparity in the way we have treated people. We are not immune to that, and we have our areas that we need to examine ourselves and perhaps areas of improvement. And I, Vince is smarter about this than I am, but I would say, as we sit right now, the Commandant is about to launch what we call our diversity and inclusion action plan. We are in the middle of we had contracted with RAND well before all this social unrest. We had contracted with RAND to do a underrepresented minority retention study. So how can we do a better job of retaining, recruiting, training and retaining our underrepresented minorities in the Coast Guard. So this has been a focus. Our Commandant has been, when he took off, and when our Commandant took the position, one of the very first things he says is, I want to make a difference. I don't want to put posters on the wall. I want to actually do things. I want tangible actions that will make a difference to everybody to make the Coast Guard a more diverse and inclusive place to serve. So he's been leaning forward even before the social unrest, and I'm proud to serve alongside of him because his heart is pure, and he really truly believes in the value of a diverse and inclusive workforce. And just real quick, as we talk about what diversity and inclusion means, as sailors, as we're all sailors here, I want to say that, for me, diversity gives you a 360-degree view of the horizon. When you're making decisions, you want to have a 360-degree perspective. And if you don't have a diverse workforce, you don't have that 360-degree perspective. If you had a radar and you were looking down at your radar and you didn't have, and part of your radar picture was missing, you weren't getting a return from it, you wouldn't stand for that. You would have that. You would fix that. You would do something about that. And that's what diversity does for us, is it gives us that 360-degree radar picture. And then inclusion, as you have your watch, quarter, and station bill, and you're on the ship, and your DCA is filling out the watch, quarter, and station bill, you don't leave anybody off. There's nobody that's not, even if you're temporarily assigned to the ship, you're on the watch, quarter, and station bill. Everybody has a role. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do, and everybody feels like they have a job on that watch, quarter, and station bill. Well, that's the way inclusion is. Everybody should feel valued. They should see their place on that watch, quarter, and station bill. And if they don't, then we need to do something about that and make sure that they do. So that's how I paint the picture of why diversity and inclusion is such an important aspect to the Coast Guard. And I'd like to give Vince the last word, if I could, please.
Well, the only thing I want to add to what Jason has pointed out is, he's kind of employed me to be part of this amazing opportunity. In fact, earlier today, I spoke to the Leadership Diversity Advisory Council at Base Seattle, and I'm going to be doing a few more. Gosh, the list is getting even longer. But the key part of this is that I want to add is that the Coast Guard is out in front of this, really, really, truly out in front of this, as what Jason had pointed out. And I can't be any more prouder than my Coast Guard than I am today under the challenging situations that we have faced. And I think to our advantage of being out in front is because of all the military services. Our service has much more direct exposure and impact to the American public, as well as the world public for that matter, than the other services have as a result of that. So it's very important, very key for us to be involved and be proactive in doing these kinds of things. Sure, we got some bad actors in there, and we're working on getting those out. But I will tell you that the proactivity that our Commandant, our Master Chief of the Coast Guard, has been putting involved in this is that it's a complete, wonderful winning team that's making this work.
Now, these are rock solid answers, and I really appreciate your openness and willingness to discuss with these issues and to really put it in the forefront. So thank you so much for those comments.
Thank you, Vince, for staying involved. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we are coming towards the end. I know we're going a little bit long, so I thank everybody for being patient with us. But I'm enjoying this conversation so much. I'm a little bit happy that we're going long. But thanks so much for being with us. We did have one question though from Chris Harper. I guess he was recently pinned E7, and what he was looking for was a little bit of words of wisdom from each of you on what he should be thinking about as he's now being welcomed into the mess. So maybe as closing statements from each of you, if you could maybe talk about that.
Okay, I'll be.
Vince, I would love for you to have the last word. It would mean a lot if you would have the last word. So Chief Harper, I would tell you that what we need from you is to be engaged. You need to utilize the mess, be a valued member of the mess, attend Chief's calls. The strength of the Coast Guard is in the Chief. There's a book by a Navy captain of a ship that says, "Go ask the Chief," and that's the truth. Just remember that one chief represents all chiefs. So everything you do either reflects greatly on the Chief's mess or could potentially reflect poorly. Just make sure you're in the great part of that. And we look forward to having you. And remember, your energy and your enthusiasm is contagious. Seldom will your people bring more energy or enthusiasm to the workplace than you. They look to you as a role model. So be that role model for them, like Vince Patton was a role model for me.
And I'll just make it in three things. Be the example, set the pace, and follow the standards of conduct. Be the example is pretty much clear, is the fact that first and foremost, remember, particularly even before you pin those anchors on, is that remind yourself that you live in a glass house. And as you become the chief, even more so, people will look up to you. Everybody will look up to you regardless of rank, status, and structure. So you've got to always be the example. Don't disappoint anybody. Set the pace. It's about enthusiasm. It's about passion. It's about interest and involvement. That's what you have to do. And the things that what are important and the things that we talked about today, particularly with the crisis of what's happening today with the COVID-19, with racial unrest and so forth, be involved, set the pace of helping with others and gathering people along to work together, and follow the standards of conduct. It goes back to my first part about be the example, is that you live in a glass house. And rules are there particularly for you, not only to help to enforce, but to also to follow and to be that particular example. Be the example, set the pace, and follow the standards of conduct.
Well, great. Thank you so much. So I've had a very sincere pleasure to spend the last hour with Vince Patton, the 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and Jason Vanderhaden, the 13th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard. You both are a wealth of knowledge and obviously a beacon of leadership for the Coast Guard. And we certainly appreciate all that you've done and the service that you've given and are giving to this country. So thank you for joining us, for being part of this Naval Order webinar series. We certainly thank you so much for spending your time with us and really being able to talk to the people of the Coast Guard and others that are interested in the sea services and what we can do to support this nation. So thanks everybody for joining. This webinar will be available so that people can access it and share it, share the link. So if you have any friends that weren't able to join, please forward the link to them. But again, if you're interested in the Naval Order or what we do to support the history and the sea services generally, please also look out and try to get more information from us. So thanks everyone. Have a good evening and fair winds and following seas.
All right. Thank
Good
you.
night.